Hey, what's up everyone, Danny here. I was one of the lucky people chosen to receive a Founders Edition RTX 3080 from Nvidia to check out. By the time this video goes live, the embargo would have already lifted a few days ago, so I'm kind of late to the game. I knew well ahead of time that I wasn't going to be able to hit day one coverage. Not only that though, but I know that if I paired the 3080 with the most high-end hardware possible to try to bottleneck it, I likely wouldn't be bringing anything new to the table that a lot of the other channels wouldn't have already covered. I'm sure that they'll cover the high-end pairings for this card much better than I could ever do, since they have a larger collection of data across a lot more hardware. So I decided to take a different approach for my testing for my initial coverage of the 3080 anyways. So in this video, we're going to check that out. So the other week, I put out a poll asking my community, you all, what CPU you have in your system. I polled both YouTube and Twitter, and among the entry-level, mid-range, high-end, and enthusiast options I gave, the clear winner was the equivalent of a current-gen Ryzen 5 or Core i5 processor. So those polls were for this video so that I could cater to you. I wanted the test bench for the RTX 3080 to be the most representative of what most of you have out there at home. I wanted to figuratively put this card into your builds. And this is going to be for those of you out there who may not be able to afford this card, so that you won't be able to see these results in person for yourself, or maybe you're convinced that it's not even worth considering for your system because of the potential bottlenecking. I mean, there's no way that pairing a brand new $700 graphics card that just came out with a year-old CPU that's worth like $160 or so, there's no way that makes any sense, right? Well, we're actually going to see. I wanted to test it regardless of any preconceived notions I had going in, and that's exactly what I did. So let's go over the details of the test system. We're running with a Ryzen 5 3600 at stock clock speeds, and we're rocking the stock Wraith cooler. I've got it in the ASRock Pro 4 B450 motherboard, a very popular and solid budget board. There's 16 gigabytes of Team Group Delta RGB RAM at 3200 MHz CL16. The case is the NZXT H510, a pretty popular and affordable case that looks great, with the downside of being a solid front panel case as opposed to having mesh, but we won't be anywhere near throttling temperatures on either the CPU or GPU, so it'll be alright. I'll let you read the rest of the specs for yourself if you're interested, but we've covered the most important components that would affect the scores. And a system like this with a $250-ish graphics card would have cost you around $700 to $800 in the last year or so. This is a pretty modest build, right? So we're going to take that and slap the $700 RTX 3080 into it, and we're pretty much good to go. Oh yeah, and if you're looking at that 650 watt power supply and thinking to yourself, hold up, didn't Nvidia say we needed at least 750 watts to run the RTX 3080? Well, you kind of don't. The minimum recommendations are just that. It's a recommendation, and it's typically pretty conservative because they have no idea what else you're throwing into your system or what quality of power supply you're going to be using. So they have to kind of estimate on the higher side to, play it safe. The system ran fine with the RTX 3080 and the 650 watt Corsair CXM unit in it. And to be sure I wouldn't run into any issues, I ran a Prime 95 torture test concurrently with Furmark, which is kind of an extreme example and should envelope most situations that a typical person would be using their computer for, and the graphics card and CPU package was pulling no more than 400 watts combined. Now I know that doesn't account for everything in the system, as there's also storage drives, system memory, the motherboard fans, things like that, but I also tracked how much power the entire system was pulling during this test from the wall, and it never passed 500 watts. So take some efficiency knockdowns into account, and we're good here so long as we're using a quality power supply and not some garbage tier unit that can't supply anywhere near what it's rated for. All tests were performed at both 1440p and 4K, as I think those are the target resolutions for anyone who's seriously considering this card. I also wanted to compare it to something from the last generation though, to see what kind of gains we're making and to see if there would be any obvious bottlenecks. Like for instance, if we saw zero performance gains going from card X to the 3080, then we would know there's a bottleneck in the CPU. And for this, I think the most popular choice would have been the RTX 2080 Ti, because that was last generation's flagship card. The only thing is, I don't have one. The 2080 Super, however, this came out just a little bit over a year ago at the exact same price point as the 3080, $699. So I used this as a comparison, and we're going to be seeing what a roughly 1 year gap in performance looks like for products of the same price bracket when used in a modest system. So if all of that sounds good, then let's look at the results. We'll start off with Unison superposition. There's no preset 1440p run, so I used the exact same presets as the 4K optimized run except for changing the resolution, and the 3080 scored 22,231 and the 2080 Super came in at 17,455, so the 3080 sees a 27% increase in performance here. For the preset 4K optimized run, the 3080 scored 13,648 and the 2080 Super scored 9,495, so that's a 44% increase going to the 3080. Next up is Firestrike Extreme, which is 3D Mark's DirectX 11 test in 1440p. I want you to ignore the big score shown up top there because that takes into account the physics and combined runs, which are impacted by the CPU. For these synthetics, I want to compare the performance purely to the graphics card and isolate it from the rest of the system. Here, the 3080 scored 20,839 and the 2080 Super scored 13,848, showing the 3080 to be 50% faster. In Firestrike Ultra, we see the 4K performance of the 3080 scoring 10,668 and the 2080 Super comes in at 6,819, which makes the 3080 57% faster. Moving on to Timespy, which showcases DirectX 12 performance at 1440p, the 3080 scored 17,218 and the 2080 Super scored 11,584, so the 3080 sees a 49% lead here. In Timespy Extreme, which is in 4K, we see the 3080 score 8,617, which is 60% faster than the 2080 Super, which scored 5,392. The next test I ran was the Bright Memory Infinite benchmark, which is ray tracing and DLSS focused. I ran it with ray tracing set to high and DLSS set to quality. The 3080 scored a 72 average FPS, whereas the 2080 scored 42 average in 1440p. That's a 71% performance increase for the 3080, with a nice improvement in the 1% minimum frame rates too. Looking at the same settings in 4K, the 3080 achieved 37 FPS average and the 2080 Super came in at 22 FPS average, showing that the 3080 was 68% faster and with more than double the 1% minimum FPS performance. Now let's take a look at some games, and we'll start with the shooters first. In Rainbow Six Siege, run on the Vulkan API at the ultra preset graphics settings and 100% render scale, the 3080 achieved 278 FPS average and the 2080 Super came in at 204 FPS, so the 3080 led by 36%. At 4K, the 3080 saw 161 FPS average, leading by 46% compared to the 2080 Super, which was seeing 110 FPS on average. At Apex Legends at max settings, I manually ran through the exact same route in the firing range so I could get as similar as environments as possible, and at 1440p the 3080 was averaging 209 FPS, which was 31% faster than the 2080 Super, which averaged 159 FPS. At 4K, the gap widens a little bit, with the 3080 leading by 42% at an average of 135 FPS compared to the 95 FPS output by the 2080 Super. In Call of Duty Warzone, at max settings, 100% render resolution with ray tracing turned on, I ran across the quarry on the Warzone training map, which is very representative of live match performance, and the 3080 averaged 156 FPS, which was 42% faster than the 2080 Super, which came in at 110 FPS. At 4K, the performance gap is 50%, where the 3080 leads with a 99 FPS average compared to 66 on the 2080 Super. Fortnite is getting ray tracing, so I wanted to check that out to see what the performance looked like. I played the custom lobby designed to show off the new features. It's called the Treasure Run. At 1440p, playing at the Epic preset and all ray tracing and DLSS settings maxed out, I was seeing an average of 69 FPS. This is 48% higher than the 2080 Super, which averaged 42 FPS. At 4K, the 3080 saw 35 FPS average and the 2080 Super saw 19, for a huge difference of 84%. Now, that percentage difference doesn't mean much though, because both cards scored pretty low to begin with, and I'm not sure if anyone should really be proud of an 84% boost when everything was scored so low and the averages 1% and 0.1% lows, especially on the 2080 Super at 4K, were so bad. Frame rate aside though, the visual difference between ray tracing on and off in this demo was very noticeable. Like right here, you can see the reflective handrails show some blurry clouds without ray tracing, but when you turn it on, it actually shows the reflection of the building. And in the hallway with the night armor sets, you can see a drastic difference with regards to the shadows with the ray tracing on and off. The edges are much softer and there's just way more shadow with it turned on. Unfortunately, the performance takes too big of a hit with those settings on though, more so than any competitive player would ever want to play with anyways. So while it looks nicer, it just doesn't feel good at the lower frame rates. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was run at the highest graphics preset with DLSS turned on and RTX shadows at the highest setting. At 1440p, the 3080 completed the benchmark with an average 81 FPS, only 19% faster than the 2080 Super, which came in at an average 68 FPS. The performance gap in this one was the smallest one we've seen so far. At 4K, however, the gap widens, with the 3080 seeing 66 FPS on average, which is 50% faster than the 2080 Super, which saw 44 FPS average. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I ran at the very high graphics preset. At 1440p, the 3080 comes in at an 85 FPS average, leading the 2080 Super's 68 FPS average, but that's only an increase of 25%. Similar to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, this is a smaller lead than most of the other titles, so I think there's some indication of CPU bottlenecking here. At 4K, the performance gap opens up just a little as the 3080 averages 64 FPS, leading the 2080's average 48 FPS, so that's a 33% gain there. Next up is Control, one of the most developed titles when it comes to ray tracing implementation in a video game. This is the poster child for ray tracing technology. I played at max settings, and for 1440p I had the DLSS scaling set to 960p, and the 3080 averaged 103 FPS, leading by 51% compared to the 2080 Super, which came in at an average of 68 FPS. Testing at 4K with the DLSS scaling set to 1080p, this resulted in the RTX 3080 averaging 84 FPS, leading by 53% compared to the 55% average achieved by the 2080 Super. Death Stranding is the last and final title that I ran. Settings were maxed out with DLSS set to quality. This is the one title where I hit the most noticeable bottlenecking. At 1440p, the 3080 came in at 117 FPS average, and the 2080 Super scored 120 FPS average. Now, these results are near identical, and I'm going to chalk up the difference due to the slight variations in the run path. At 4K, we see the 3080 come in at 113 FPS average, so it's almost identical to the 1440p performance. But if we look at the RTX 2080 Super, it dropped to 88 FPS average, so the bottleneck is now in the RTX 2080 Super. So to wrap up the results, here's a summary of the average FPS difference between the 3080 versus the 2080 Super. Looking at all the numbers, we can see some indications of CPU bottlenecking whenever we see a very small difference in performance between the two cards at 1440p and then that gap widening at 4K, such as with Shadow of the Tomb Raider and with Death Stranding. Those two I think were the most apparent examples of CPU bottlenecking. With all that said though, overall there was still a pretty sizable performance increase when we went to the RTX 3080 from the 2080 Super. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with the Founders Edition RTX 3080. I think $699 for this leaves a much better taste in everybody's mouth compared to paying $1,200 for the 2080 Ti when that came out, and all the way up to like a week ago. Next, I plan on getting this into a system that's a little bit more balanced. I'll do that in an upcoming build video where I feature it alongside some higher end parts. So when I repeat the benchmarks, any of the apparent bottlenecks seen in this video, they will either completely go away or become a lot less severe. So definitely keep an eye out for that. So now for the $1 million question of the day, and to end the video with, should you go out and buy a $700 RTX 3080 if you're sitting at home right now with your $700 PC right next to you? I'm not saying yes, but I'm also not necessarily saying no either, especially with what we saw in the results that I just presented. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. I'm not here to convince you to buy this graphics card. I'm here to just create whatever videos I feel like creating. And for this one, I decided that I wanted to do it a little bit differently than what I thought most of the other channels would be doing for the release of this card. And I wanted to share it with you all and let you come to your own conclusions based on what I presented. So definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments below and how you would answer that question. I want to give a huge thanks to Nvidia for setting this over for me to check out and for just including me as part of the launch. Like, this launch had so much hype behind it and so many people were excited about it that I feel completely honored that I was able to receive a sample from them to check out. So big shout out to them, and I want to thank you all as always for watching and for supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it, and I look forward to reading all your comments and answers to the questions down in the comments below. And yeah, I'll see you down there as well as in the next video. Bye.